At 11:23 a.m. on March 15, 1945, Sergeant Bill Morrison watched a German soldier step out from behind a bombed-out butcher shop in Worms, Germany, carrying a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon aimed directly at his half-track from maybe 20 yards away. Morrison had no time to reverse, no time to dismount, no time to do anything but watch that shaped charge rocket screaming toward him at 148 feet per second. In 1.2 seconds, that warhead would detonate against his vehicle's thin armor plating and turn everyone inside into a memory. Except Morrison's half-track wasn't standard issue anymore. He'd wrapped it in 47 truck tire chains he'd scavenged from burned-out supply trucks, and every single officer in the 7th Armored Division had told him to take them off. They called it ugly, they called it unauthorized, they called it tactically idiotic. Morrison called it the only reason he was still alive. The Panzerfaust hit the chain's dead center. What happened next made absolutely no sense to anyone watching, but it made perfect sense to a farm kid from Nebraska who grew up understanding that sometimes the best armor isn't what the manual says it should be. You see, folks, this is one of those stories that reminds us why we can't always trust the experts sitting behind desks. Sometimes the guy in the field, the one actually getting shot at, knows something those clipboard carriers don't. And before we go any further, I want you to do me a favor. If you're enjoying these stories about real American ingenuity under fire, hit that like button. It helps me keep bringing you these forgotten histories that deserve to be remembered. These men didn't fight for recognition, but they sure as hell deserve it now. All right, let's get back to Bill Morrison and his tire chains. Bill Morrison grew up in Kearney, Nebraska, right in the middle of the state where the Platte River splits into the north and south branches. His father ran a small farm, 160 acres of corn and wheat, that barely produced enough to keep the bank from foreclosing during the Depression. Bill was the oldest of 4 kids, which meant he worked like a man before he hit 13, up before dawn, feeding livestock, repairing equipment, doing whatever it took to keep the operation running. The Morrison farm couldn't afford new machinery. Hell, they could barely afford to keep the old machinery running. So Bill learned early that you don't throw something away just because it's broken. You fix it, you improvise, you use what you've got. When the tractor's belt broke in the middle of harvest season, they didn't have money for a replacement. Bill's father showed him how to braid together lengths of old rope and leather to make a temporary drive belt that held for 3 more years. When the plow blade cracked, they welded it back together with scrap metal from a junked Model T. The welds were ugly as sin, but they held. You learn something important growing up like that. You learn that the prettiest solution isn't always the best solution. You learn that function beats form every single time. And you learn that the folks telling you there's only one right way to do something usually aren't the ones whose lives depend on getting it done. Bill enlisted in February 1943, 2 months after his 20th birthday. The farm was struggling, and his younger brothers could handle the work. The recruiter in Grand Island promised training, adventure, and a chance to see Europe. Bill got 12 weeks at Fort Knox, learning to operate armored vehicles, a promotion to corporal, and a ride on a Liberty ship to England. By June 1944, he was driving a half-track for the 7th Armored Division, participating in the breakout from Normandy. Half-tracks were the workhorses of mechanized infantry. M3 model, built by White Motor Company, powered by a 6-cylinder engine that could push the 20,000-pound vehicle to 45 miles per hour on roads. The front had wheels like a truck, the rear had tank-style tracks. They could carry 12 men plus a crew of 3, mount a 50-caliber machine gun, and theoretically provide protection against small arms fire. Theoretically. The reality was different. The armor on an M3 half-track was 3/8 of an inch thick on the best sections. That stopped rifle rounds and shrapnel. It didn't stop much else. A Panzerfaust would punch through it like wet cardboard. So would a Panzerschreck, an 88mm shell, or even heavy machine gun fire at close range. The Army knew this. The manuals acknowledged it. The solution was supposed to be combined arms tactics. Infantry screens out ahead, artillery support from behind, air superiority overhead. You weren't supposed to expose half-tracks to direct anti-tank fire, but combat doesn't care what you're supposed to do. See, the thing about tactical doctrine is that it assumes perfect conditions. It assumes you've got full unit strength, proper support, good communication, and terrain that cooperates with your plans. The reality in Europe in 1944 and 45 was nothing like that. You had units operating at 60% strength because replacements couldn't keep up with casualties. You had artillery that was low on ammunition because supply lines were stretched thin. You had air support that couldn't fly when the weather was bad, which in Northern Europe meant half the damn time. And you had half-tracks that were supposed to stay behind the infantry screen but kept getting pushed forward because that's where they were needed. Because some captain needed to move his men from point A to point B, and the half-tracks were the only transportation available. Because some mission required mechanized support and the tanks were committed elsewhere. Because war is chaos and nobody fights according to the manual when the bullets start flying. Morrison learned this fast. His first month in combat taught him more about real tactical situations than 12 weeks at Fort Knox ever could. The manual said, maintain spacing. Reality said, bunch up or get picked off individually. The manual said, avoid urban terrain. Reality said, fight through every town and village because that's where the Germans were dug in. The manual said half-tracks provide mobility and fire support. Reality said half-tracks were coffins on wheels if you exposed them to anti-tank weapons. By September 1944, Morrison had seen 11 half-tracks in his battalion destroyed by German anti-tank weapons. Panzerfausts mostly, but also Panzerschrecks and Teller mines. Each destroyed vehicle meant dead or maimed soldiers. The official response from division was to maintain proper tactical spacing and avoid exposure to known anti-tank positions, which was about as useful as telling sailors to avoid icebergs by not sailing where icebergs might be. Private Tommy Chen died on September 14, 1944. His half-track took a Panzerfaust round from a Hitler Youth kid hiding in a barn outside Nancy, France. The shaped charge penetrated the side armor and detonated inside. Chen was the driver. He was 21 years old from Sacramento, used to work in his family's restaurant, wanted to go to college after the war. The explosion killed him instantly along with 4 other men in the crew compartment. Sergeant Mike Callahan died on September 29th. Another Panzerfaust, this time from a hedgerow ambush near Metz. The rocket hit the front glacis at an angle and deflected upward into the crew compartment. Callahan was from Boston, a pipe fitter's son with a wife and a 2-year-old daughter he'd never met. The Army sent the telegram on October 3rd. By the time it arrived, his wife was 7 months pregnant with their second child. Corporal Eddie Walsh died on October 12th. His half-track rolled over a Teller mine that the engineers had somehow missed. The explosion lifted the entire vehicle 6 feet off the ground. Walsh was thrown clear, but landed wrong. Broke his neck. He was from Chicago, South Side, worked at the stockyards before enlisting. Always shared his cigarettes, even when he only had a few left. Morrison knew every one of them. He'd served with Chen since basic training. Callahan had taught him how to navigate by stars when the compass failed. Walsh always had a joke, even when things were grim. And now they were gone. Not because they'd made mistakes, not because they'd been careless, just because half-track armor couldn't stop German anti-tank weapons, and nobody in command seemed interested in doing anything about it except issuing reminders about proper spacing. It made Morrison angry. Not the hot anger that burns out quick, but the cold anger that sits in your gut and makes you start thinking. The kind of anger that asks questions like, what if there's something I can do? What if the manual doesn't have all the answers? What if the officers who keep telling us to maintain spacing are wrong? The idea came to him on October 18, 1944. His platoon was bivouacked in a rear area near Verdun for maintenance and rest. Morrison was walking through the vehicle graveyard where destroyed trucks and tanks sat waiting for salvage or scrap. He saw a burned-out deuce-and-a-half cargo truck, the kind with big six-wheel tires for hauling supplies through mud. The truck was totaled, but the tire chains were still attached to the rear wheels. Tire chains, heavy steel links designed to give traction in snow and mud. Morrison looked at them for a long moment, thinking about weight distribution and impact absorption and the way metal mesh could disperse energy. Back on the farm, his father had used chains to reinforce the wooden bed of their old pickup truck. The chains distributed the load, prevented cracking. What if that principle worked for armor? See, Morrison understood something about shaped charges that most soldiers didn't. Not from training, but from observation. He'd seen what Panzerfausts did when they hit armor at the optimal range. The warhead needed a specific standoff distance to form the penetrating jet properly. Too close to the target, and the jet didn't have room to form. Too far, and it dissipated before contact. The sweet spot for most shaped charges was between 6 and 12 inches from the target surface. That's why tank armor worked the way it did. Thick steel that the jet couldn't penetrate even at optimal formation. But half-track armor wasn't thick. It was 3/8 of an inch, barely enough to stop rifle rounds. A shaped charge at optimal standoff would punch through it like it wasn't even there. But what if you moved the impact point? What if instead of hitting solid armor at the perfect distance, the charge detonated against something else first? Something that would disrupt the jet formation before it reached the real armor. The chains wouldn't stop the warhead from detonating, but they might scatter the jet enough to reduce penetration. It was a theory, unproven. Based on Morrison's understanding of mechanics and shaped charges and how energy dispersed through different materials. He had no way to test it safely. He had no engineering data. He just had an idea and a willingness to bet his life on it. He pulled the chains off the burned truck that night. 4 sets, each maybe 12 feet long, thick steel links covered in rust and mud. He cleaned them up as best he could, then started wrapping them around his half-track's hull. Starting at the front, weaving them through the tie-down points, overlapping them so they formed a kind of mesh layer over the armor plating. It took him 3 hours. When he finished, his half-track looked like it had been attacked by a deranged blacksmith. The chains hung loose in some places, tight in others. They rattled when the vehicle moved. They looked absolutely ridiculous. Sergeant First Class Crawford found him the next morning. Crawford was the platoon sergeant, 15 years in the Army, a by-the-book lifer who believed the manual was gospel and deviations were sin. Morrison, what the hell did you do to your track? Reinforcement, Sergeant. Extra protection against shaped charges. Crawford walked around the vehicle slowly, taking in the chains. His expression suggested Morrison had just painted the thing bright pink. This is unauthorized modification of Army property. You need to remove it immediately. Sergeant, I think this might actually work. The chains could disperse the impact from a Panzerfaust, maybe deflect the round entirely. Corporal, I don't care what you think. Field Manual 1767 is very clear on approved armor modifications. This, Crawford gestured at the chains, is not on the list. Remove it before the lieutenant sees it. Morrison said nothing. He didn't remove the chains. Lieutenant Parker saw them 2 hours later. Parker was 23 years old, fresh from officer candidate school, book smart but combat dumb. He'd been with the platoon for 3 weeks. He walked up to Morrison's half-track, stared at the chains for a solid 30 seconds, then turned to Morrison with the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering someone had urinated in the coffee pot. "Corporal Morrison, is this some kind of joke?" "No, sir. It's protection. It's a disaster. It looks like you hit a hardware store at 60 miles per hour. It's ugly, it's unmilitary, and I guarantee it doesn't work. Shaped charges are designed to penetrate armor. A bunch of truck chains aren't going to stop them." "Sir, I think they might. The chains create spacing between the charge and the actual armor. That could disrupt the jet formation when the warhead detonates." Parker stared at him. "Morrison, I appreciate creative thinking, but this is ridiculous. The engineers who design our armor have degrees from MIT. They've run tests. They know what works. If chains were effective, don't you think they'd already be using them?" "Maybe the engineers aren't the ones getting shot at," Morrison said quietly. That earned him 3 seconds of very cold silence. Then Parker said, "Remove the chains. That's an order. You have until 1400 hours. If they're still on your vehicle after that, I'll write you up for destruction of government property." Morrison removed the chains. He coiled them up and stored them under a tarp in the back of his track. But he didn't throw them away, and he didn't stop thinking about them. The thing was, Morrison had seen Parker's logic. The engineers did have degrees. They had run tests. They knew more about metallurgy and explosive physics than a farm kid from Nebraska ever would. But they weren't here. They weren't watching men burn to death in vehicles that couldn't withstand the weapons everyone knew the Germans had. The engineers might be smarter, but Morrison was the one getting shot at. And that made all the difference. There's a principle in military innovation that gets overlooked in most histories. The best solutions often come from the bottom up, not the top down. Officers and engineers design systems for ideal conditions. Enlisted men modify those systems for actual conditions. The gap between design and reality gets filled by corporals and sergeants who can't afford to wait for official approval because waiting costs lives. Morrison represented that principle perfectly. He wasn't smarter than the engineers. He wasn't better trained than the officers, but he had skin in the game in a way they didn't. His life depended on solving this problem. So did the lives of the men riding in his track. That motivation, that immediate personal stake, it drove innovation in ways no research budget ever could. Still, removing the chains hurt, not physically but psychologically. Every time Morrison looked at his bare half-track after that, he thought about Chen and Callahan and Walsh. He thought about how they'd died because standard armor wasn't good enough. And he thought about how he'd had a possible solution and an officer had ordered him to abandon it based on theory rather than testing. But he was a good soldier. He followed orders. He removed the chains. And he waited for the next Panzerfaust to prove him right or prove him wrong. 3 days later, on October 21st, the platoon moved back to the front. They were supporting the 7th Armored Division's push toward the German border, hauling infantry through the Vosges Mountains. The terrain was rough, the weather was cold, and the Germans were fighting for every mile. Morrison's half-track was carrying 8 riflemen from the 23rd Armored Infantry Battalion. Good soldiers, experienced, the kind who knew when to keep their heads down. The convoy got hit at 3:47 p.m. on a narrow forest road 6 miles east of Luneville. 3 Panzerfausts fired from concealed positions in the tree line. The first one missed completely. The second hit Lieutenant Parker's track, penetrated the side armor, killed Parker and his driver instantly. The third hit a supply truck, set it on fire. Morrison watched it happen from 50 yards back. He saw Parker's track burning, heard the screaming, knew there was nothing he could do. The riflemen in the back of his track were yelling, asking what was happening, ready to dismount and fight. Morrison made a decision. That night, after they'd secured the area and recovered what they could from Parker's track, Morrison went back to his half-track and pulled out the tire chains. He worked by flashlight, rewrapping the chains around the hull exactly like he'd done before. Same pattern, same coverage, same ridiculous appearance. When he finished, he sat on the hull and waited for someone to notice. The recovery of Parker's track had been grim work. The Panzerfaust had penetrated the crew compartment and detonated inside. The explosion had been contained by the armor, which meant all that energy went into the people instead of dissipating outward. Morrison had helped pull bodies out. He'd known these men, had eaten with them, joked with them, shared cigarettes during quiet moments. Now he was zipping them into body bags while their blood soaked into the French mud. That kind of thing changes you, makes you angry in a cold, determined way, makes you stop caring about regulations and start caring only about preventing the next death. Parker had ordered Morrison to remove the chains based on engineering theory and proper military appearance. Parker was dead now, killed by the exact threat Morrison had been trying to defend against. The irony wasn't lost on Morrison. Neither was the lesson. Follow the manual and die, or break the rules and maybe live. When the choice is that stark, the decision becomes easy. Morrison wrapped those chains slowly and carefully, making sure the coverage was complete, making sure the standoff distance was consistent. He thought about Chen and Callahan and Walsh and Parker. He thought about every man he'd seen die in a half-track because 3/8 of an inch of steel wasn't enough. And he made a promise to their memory. No more. Not if he could help it. Not if this worked. The chains rattled when he tightened the last link. The sound was oddly comforting, like armor putting itself on, like protection clicking into place. It probably wouldn't work. The engineers were probably right. But at least he was trying. At least he wasn't just accepting that men had to die because that's what the manual said would happen. Sergeant Crawford noticed at dawn. He walked over, looked at the chains, looked at Morrison. "Lieutenant Parker's dead," Morrison said before Crawford could speak. "Panzerfaust went through his armor like tissue paper. I'm not taking these off." Crawford was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "If the new platoon leader orders you to remove them, you remove them. Understood?" "Understood, Sergeant." But Crawford didn't report it, and when Second Lieutenant Hoskins arrived 2 days later to take over the platoon, Crawford made sure Hoskins was too busy with maps and briefings to notice Morrison's chains for almost a week. The word spread fast among the other drivers. Morrison wasn't following regulations. Morrison had wrapped his track in junk. Morrison thought he knew better than the Army engineers, but Morrison was also the guy whose friends had just burned to death, and nobody wanted to tell him he was wrong while the memory was that fresh. Private Danny O'Brien was the first to copy the idea. O'Brien was from Pittsburgh, a steelworker's kid who understood metal and stress and impact. He scrounged chains from another wrecked truck and spent a night wrapping his half-track. By early November, 4 vehicles in the platoon had chain armor. None of them had permission. All of them looked terrible. When Lieutenant Hoskins finally noticed, his response was predictable. "What in God's name is this?" "Protection, sir," Morrison said. "Extra standoff against shaped charges." Hoskins walked around Morrison's track, then O'Brien's, then the other two. He was young, but not stupid. He could see the logic, even if he didn't like the appearance. "Has Division approved this?" "No, sir." "Has anyone tested it?" "Not officially, sir." "So you're running unauthorized modifications based on a theory," Hoskins said. "That could be considered destruction of Army property. It could also be considered initiative under fire." "I'm not sure which," "Sir, if it works, it saves lives. If it doesn't, I'll take full responsibility." Hoskins thought about that. Then he said, "I'm not ordering you to remove them, but I'm also not authorizing them. If anyone from Division asks, you did this on your own initiative without command approval. Clear?" "Clear, sir." It was the best Morrison could hope for. Hoskins was covering his own ass while giving Morrison room to operate. The chains stayed. By late November 1944, 9 half-tracks in the battalion were running chain armor. The method varied. Some drivers used truck chains like Morrison. Others used tank track links, scavenged from destroyed Panthers and Shermans. One enterprising corporal welded together a mesh of reinforcing bar he'd pulled from bombed buildings. They all looked insane. They all rattled. They all violated field manual specifications. And none of them had been hit yet, so nobody knew if they actually worked. The uncertainty weighed on Morrison more than he'd expected. He'd committed to this theory. He'd convinced other drivers to adopt it. But without a real-world test, it was all just speculation. What if the chains didn't work? What if they made things worse somehow? What if a Panzerfaust hit, and the chains directed the blast into the crew compartment instead of away from it? Morrison had nightmares about that. Dreams where he watched his track take a hit, and the chains channeled the explosion directly into the men riding inside. Dreams where O'Brien's track flipped because the chains caught on something. Dreams where Hoskins court-martialed him for negligent homicide because his unauthorized modification had killed soldiers instead of saving them. But the alternative was worse. Do nothing and watch more men die in unmodified tracks. Except that 3/8 of an inch of armor wasn't enough, and there was nothing to be done about it. Morrison couldn't accept that, wouldn't accept that. So he dealt with the nightmares and kept the chains on and hoped he was right. Other drivers felt the same weight. O'Brien checked his chains every morning, looking for weak links or loose connections. Corporal Martinez spent hours adjusting his tank track installation, trying to optimize the spacing. Private First Class Johnson kept asking Morrison if he was sure this would work, and Morrison kept telling him the same thing. "I think so. That's all any of us have. A theory and a hope." The waiting was almost worse than combat. At least in a firefight, you knew what was happening. You could react, return fire, maneuver, do something. But waiting to see if your improvised armor worked, that was passive. That was trusting your own judgment against the collective wisdom of the entire U.S. Army Engineering Corps. It took a special kind of courage, or maybe a special kind of stubbornness. The test came on March 15, 1945, in Worms, Germany. The 7th Armored Division had crossed the Rhine 3 days earlier as part of Patton's Third Army. The river crossing had been brutal, but they'd made it. Now they were pushing east through urban areas where every building could hide a Panzerfaust team. Worms was a mid-sized city on the West Bank, mostly rubble by the time the Americans arrived. The Germans were fighting a delaying action, trying to slow the advance, while their main forces fell back toward the interior. The city was a nightmare of urban combat. Streets choked with rubble that channeled vehicles into kill zones. Buildings that looked empty but hid German infantry with machine guns and Panzerfausts. Civilians still hiding in basements, complicating fire missions. And everywhere, the sense that the enemy was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Morrison had been in urban combat before, but Worms felt different. The Germans were more desperate here. They knew they were losing the war, knew the Americans would keep pushing no matter what. That desperation made them more dangerous. They weren't trying to hold ground anymore. They were just trying to kill as many Americans as possible before retreating to the next defensive line. The morning of March 15th had started quiet. Too quiet. Morrison's platoon had cleared 6 blocks without contact, which made everyone nervous. The Germans were here. They had to be. But where? The infantry was moving cautiously, checking every building, every corner. The half-tracks were staying back, providing overwatch and ready to move up if needed. At 11 a.m., the platoon reached a crossroads in the southern district. 4 streets converged at a small plaza that had probably been charming before the war. Now it was just broken cobblestones and shattered buildings. The infantry set up a perimeter, while Lieutenant Hoskins studied his map, trying to determine the best route forward. Morrison's track was idling at the corner, engine running, ready to move. He had 3 soldiers in the crew compartment, riflemen from the 23rd Armored Infantry who'd been riding with him since the Rhine crossing. Good men, experienced, the kind who knew when to keep their heads down and when to fight. The 50 cal machine gun mounted on the track was unmanned because the assigned gunner, Private Lewis, had dismounted to help clear a building. The plaza felt wrong to Morrison, too open, too quiet, too perfect for an ambush. He was about to suggest they find a different route when he saw movement in one of the buildings. Just a flash, there and gone. Could have been nothing. Could have been a civilian. Could have been a German soldier positioning for an attack. Morrison's platoon was clearing the southern district, dismounted infantry moving building to building with the half-tracks providing support and transport. It was slow, dangerous work. You never knew which window held a sniper, which cellar hid a machine gun nest, which intersection had been zeroed in by mortars. At 11:20 a.m., Morrison's half-track was idling at a street corner while the infantry cleared a row of shops. He was in the driver's seat, engine running, 50 cal unmanned because the gunner had dismounted to help with the clearing. 3 other soldiers were in the crew compartment, ready to move if needed. That's when Morrison saw him. A German soldier, maybe 18 years old, wearing a Wehrmacht uniform 2 sizes too big, stepping out from behind the ruins of what used to be a butcher shop. He was carrying a Panzerfaust, the tube already across his shoulder, aimed directly at Morrison's track from approximately 20 yards away. Morrison's brain processed 3 things simultaneously. 1, the German had a perfect shot. 2, there was no time to reverse or maneuver. 3, if that Panzerfaust connected with standard armor, everyone in the track was dead. He didn't have time to think about the chains. He didn't have time to duck or pray or do anything except watch that Panzerfaust fire. The weapon made a distinctive whoosh sound when it launched. The rocket motor ignited. The shaped charge warhead accelerated to 148 feet per second. At 20 yards, the flight time was about 1.2 seconds. Morrison saw it coming, a streak of smoke and fire growing larger impossibly fast. The warhead hit the front left section of the hull where Morrison had double-wrapped the tire chains. What happened next took maybe 1/10 of a second but felt like a lifetime. The shaped charge detonated on contact with the chains, exactly as designed. The warhead's explosive formed a superheated jet of molten copper meant to burn through armor like a blowtorch through butter. But instead of hitting solid steel plate at the optimal standoff distance, the jet hit a mesh of loose steel chains hanging 6 inches in front of the actual armor. The chains didn't stop the jet, but they disrupted it. The molten copper stream hit the moving, rattling steel links and scattered. Pieces of the jet punched through individual chain links, but the coherent penetrator that was supposed to burn through 8 inches of armor plate fragmented into a dozen smaller streams. By the time those streams reached the actual hull armor, they'd lost most of their energy and focus. The explosion was still enormous. The blast wave rocked the half-track, shattered the windscreen, filled the crew compartment with smoke and the smell of burning metal. Morrison's ears rang like church bells. He couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched whine. For 3 seconds he thought he was dead and just didn't know it yet. Then he moved his hands. They worked. He moved his feet. They worked. He turned his head, and even though everything hurt and he couldn't hear, he could see. The crew compartment was filled with smoke, but no fire. The men in back were coughing, disoriented, but alive. No penetration, no casualties. Morrison's mind was racing even as his body struggled to function. The Panzerfaust had hit. He'd seen it, felt it, knew it should have killed them. But they were alive. The chains had worked. Holy shit! The chains had actually worked. But there was no time to process that. Combat doesn't stop because you need a moment to appreciate not being dead. Morrison's training kicked in. Check for damage, check crew status, assess situation, prepare to fight or retreat. He tried to speak, but his voice sounded distant and muffled through the ringing in his ears. The driver's side door was jammed. The blast had warped the frame. Morrison kicked it hard twice before it popped open. He half fell, half climbed out onto the street, his legs unsteady, his balance off from the concussion. The world looked strange, tilted somehow, like he was seeing it through water. Smoke was pouring from the front of his track where the Panzerfaust had hit. The chains in that section were destroyed, melted, and twisted by the shaped charge detonation. But beyond the chains, the hull armor looked intact. Scorched, dented, but not penetrated. Morrison's tactical mind was cataloging details even through the shock and disorientation. Impact point, front left quadrant. Chains dispersed the jet. Blast damaged chains and windscreen, but didn't penetrate crew compartment. Track still operational, engine still running. Crew shaken but mobile. All of that processed in maybe 5 seconds. Then the adrenaline hit properly, and Morrison's hands started shaking. They'd survived. They'd taken a direct Panzerfaust hit at optimal range and survived. The chains had worked exactly like he'd theorized, dispersing the shaped charge jet before it could penetrate the primary armor. They were alive because Morrison had wrapped his track in tire chains and refused to remove them even when ordered. He wanted to laugh, or cry, or maybe scream. But there were still Germans in the area, still a war happening, still work to do. Morrison forced himself to focus. Check the crew, secure the area, report the contact, deal with the emotional response later when there was time for it. Morrison kicked open the driver's door and fell out onto the street. His legs didn't want to work right. Everything felt like it was underwater. He could see soldiers running toward him, mouths moving, but he couldn't hear them. He looked back at his half-track. The front left section where the Panzerfaust had hit looked like it had been attacked by a giant with a blowtorch. The chains were melted, twisted, some of them blown completely off. The paint was scorched black, but the hull armor underneath was intact. Scorched, yes. Dented, yes. But not penetrated. No hole, no entry point. The Panzerfaust had hit dead on from 20 yards, optimal range, perfect angle. It should have killed everyone. Inside. But the chains had disrupted the shaped charge just enough to save their lives. Sergeant Crawford was the first one to reach Morrison. He grabbed him by the shoulders, said something Morrison couldn't hear. Morrison pointed at the track, at the impact point, trying to make Crawford understand. Crawford looked, and his expression changed. He turned to the other soldiers gathering around and started yelling orders Morrison couldn't hear. The German soldier who'd fired the Panzerfaust was already gone, sprinting down an alley. 2 riflemen went after him, but he disappeared into the ruins. Morrison didn't care. He sat on the curb, waiting for his hearing to come back, looking at his half-track and the melted chains, and thinking about how close it had been. His hearing returned gradually over the next 20 minutes. First, muffled sounds like being underwater, then voices but distorted. Finally, normal sound mixed with a persistent ringing that would last for 3 days. Lieutenant Hoskins found him sitting on the curb. The lieutenant looked at the damaged track, at Morrison, back at the track. "Holy shit," Hoskins said. "It actually worked." Morrison nodded. He still couldn't quite believe it himself. Hoskins walked around to inspect the impact site. He ran his hand over the scorched armor, examined the destroyed chains, looked through the unperforated hull into the crew compartment where 3 very shaken but very alive soldiers were climbing out. "This needs to be documented," Hoskins said. "I want photographs. I want measurements. I want a full report for division." The photographs were taken by a combat engineer named Specialist Harris, who happened to have a camera. Close-ups of the impact point, wide shots showing the chain coverage, comparison shots of unmodified half-tracks in the platoon. Harris used 2 full rolls of film, 48 exposures. The images showed clearly how the chains had been destroyed in the impact area but had prevented penetration. Harris knew what he was documenting. He'd studied engineering before the war, understood shaped charges and armor penetration. He took his time with the photographs, making sure the angles showed the damage clearly. Close-ups of the melted chains, wide shots showing the overall coverage, detail shots of the hull armor beneath the destroyed chains, showing scorch marks and deformation, but no penetration. These photographs would become some of the most important documentation of field innovation in World War II. They provided clear visual evidence that improvised spaced armor could defeat shaped charge weapons. But in the moment, Harris was just a specialist with a camera, taking pictures of a half-track that shouldn't have survived, but did. Morrison watched him work, still dealing with the aftermath of the adrenaline dump. His hands had stopped shaking, but his mind was racing. The chains had worked. His theory had been correct. But beyond personal validation, what did this mean? How? Many other half-tracks could be protected the same way? How many lives could be saved if this method spread? The 3 soldiers who'd been in the crew compartment were talking to other members of the platoon, gesturing at the damaged track, explaining what had happened. Their accounts were animated, excited. They'd been inside when the Panzerfaust hit. They'd felt the explosion, seen the flash, thought they were dead, and then they'd realized they weren't. That kind of experience bonds people, creates a story they'll tell for the rest of their lives. Private Kowalski, one of the 3, kept saying the same thing over and over. "It should have killed us. That should have killed us." He was 19 years old, from Detroit, a toolmaker's son who'd enlisted at 17. He'd seen combat before, been shot at dozens of times. But this was different. This was surviving something that by all logic should have been unsurvivable. The realization was hitting him in waves. Sergeant First Class Crawford pulled Morrison aside while Harris was still photographing. Crawford's expression was complicated. He'd been the one who'd first ordered Morrison to remove the chains. He'd followed Lieutenant Parker's lead, enforced the regulations, maintained discipline, and now those regulations had been proven wrong by a corporal's improvisation. Morrison's report was 3 pages, handwritten, technical where it needed to be, but mostly just factual. Time of impact, range, weapon type, result. He included his theory about how the chains disrupted the shaped charge jet, but he kept it simple. The photographs did most of the talking. Lieutenant Hoskins forwarded the report and photos to Battalion on March 16th, with a cover letter recommending immediate approval for chain armor modifications across all half-tracks in the division. Battalion forwarded it to Division Headquarters on March 17th. Division sent it to 3rd Army Ordnance on March 19th. The response came back on March 24th. Concept shows merit. requires engineering analysis and controlled testing before approval for general implementation. Pending evaluation, units may continue field modifications at commander discretion, which was Army speak for, "We're not going to officially approve it, but we're also not going to stop you." The real impact was on the ground. Within a week, every half-track driver in the 7th Armored Division knew about Morrison's Panzerfaust hit. The story spread like wildfire, a shaped charge from 20 yards, dead-on hit, 0 casualties. The chains worked, but the story grew in the telling, the way combat stories always do. Some versions had the Panzerfaust hitting at 10 yards. Others claimed the warhead bounced off completely instead of dispersing. A few particularly creative retellings had Morrison deliberately positioning his track to draw fire so he could test his armor theory. None of that was true, but truth matters less than narrative when soldiers are looking for hope, and hope was what Morrison's survival represented. For months, half-track crews had felt helpless against Panzerfausts. The weapons were everywhere, easy to use, deadly effective. A teenager with 10 minutes of training could destroy a 20,000-pound vehicle and kill everyone inside. That imbalance had created a sense of fatalism among drivers. You could be careful, you could be smart, but if a Panzerfaust had your number, you were dead. Nothing you could do about it. Morrison's chains changed that equation. Suddenly there was something you could do. It wasn't perfect protection, and it sure as hell wasn't Army approved, but it was something. An action you could take to improve your odds. That psychological shift mattered almost as much as the physical protection. Drivers started seeing chain armor as a symbol of taking control of your own survival. The officers might not approve, the engineers might say it wouldn't work, but you could wrap your track in chains and know you'd done everything possible to protect yourself and your crew. That sense of agency, of active participation in your own survival, it changed morale in ways that were hard to quantify but impossible to miss. Private Danny O'Brien, the first driver to copy Morrison's setup, became an evangelist for chain armor. He'd been running chains for months without knowing if they worked. Now he had proof. He spent his off hours helping other drivers install chains, showing them the proper spacing, explaining the theory behind shaped charge disruption. O'Brien had studied metallurgy before the war at a trade school in Pittsburgh. He understood stress and deformation and how energy transferred through different materials. His explanations were technical but accessible, and they gave drivers confidence that this wasn't just superstition or wishful thinking. The improvised armor movement spread across unit boundaries. A driver from the 4th Armored Division saw Morrison's damaged track during a supply run and asked questions. He took the idea back to his unit. Within days, tracks in the 4th were running chains. A mechanic from the 6th Armored visited the 7th's motor pool and noticed the pattern. He photographed Morrison's setup and replicated it when he returned to his division. Drivers started scrounging chains from every wrecked vehicle they could find. Truck chains, tank track links, lengths of heavy cable, anything that could create standoff spacing. Some modifications were careful and methodical, like Morrison's. Others were thrown together in an afternoon, chains literally wired onto the hull with whatever fasteners were available. They all looked terrible. But after Morrison's demonstration, nobody cared about appearances anymore. By mid-April, an estimated 200 half-tracks across 3rd Army were running improvised chain armor. The 4th Armored Division picked it up. The 6th Armored Division started using it. Word spread to other armies. The 1st Army tried it. The 9th Army documented 3 successful Panzerfaust deflections using chain armor in late April. The engineers finally ran controlled tests in early May 1945. They mounted chains on a half-track, positioned it at various ranges, and fired captured Panzerfausts at it. The results confirmed what Morrison had discovered by accident. Chain armor didn't guarantee protection, but it significantly reduced penetration probability. At optimal standoff distances, shaped charges were 60 to 70% less effective against chain-wrapped armor than against bare steel plate. The test report was thorough and technical. It analyzed jet formation, standoff distance, chain spacing, and armor penetration mechanics. It included mathematical models and slow-motion photography of shaped charge detonations against chain armor. The engineers had done good work, comprehensive and rigorous. They'd validated Morrison's theory with data and analysis. But here's the thing that bothered Morrison when he eventually saw the report. The testing happened in early May. Germany surrendered on May 8th. The war in Europe was essentially over by the time the engineers proved that chain armor worked. Morrison had figured it out in October 1944. He'd tested it in combat in March 1945. For 7 months, drivers had been installing chain armor based on field results and shared knowledge. Lives had been saved. Tactics had changed. Innovation had spread through the ranks. And then, after the fighting was done, the engineers confirmed what soldiers already knew from experience. This pattern frustrated Morrison more than he usually admitted. Not because he wanted credit, he genuinely didn't care about that, but because it represented something larger about how institutions learn. The Army had a system for testing and validating new equipment. That system was thorough and scientific and produced high-quality data. It was also slow, bureaucratic, and required approval from people who weren't getting shot at. Soldiers in combat couldn't wait for that system. They had problems right now that needed solutions right now. So they innovated in the field, tested under fire, and shared solutions through informal networks. Sometimes those solutions worked, sometimes they didn't. But the speed of implementation was measured in days, not months. The validation came from survival, not from laboratory testing. Morrison understood both approaches had value. You needed rigorous testing for equipment that would be mass-produced and distributed Army-wide. You couldn't scale field modifications without proper engineering analysis. But you also couldn't wait for that analysis when men were dying daily from a threat you could potentially defend against. The ideal would have been some kind of rapid prototype system where field innovations could be quickly evaluated and either approved or rejected. Something faster than the normal procurement process, but more rigorous than just trying stuff and hoping it worked. Morrison thought about that a lot in the years after the war. How do you balance speed and thoroughness? How do you encourage innovation without endorsing recklessness? He never came up with a perfect answer. Neither did the Army. Even today, military institutions struggle with the tension between field innovation and formal approval. Special operations units tend to favor rapid adaptation. Conventional forces tend to favor standardized procedures. Both approaches have advantages. Both have blind spots. The engineering report recommended formal adoption of spaced armor techniques for light armored vehicles. But by the time the report was issued in June 1945, the war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered on May 8th. The half-tracks with their improvised chain armor were being mothballed or shipped to the Pacific. Morrison never found out if his specific innovation was officially adopted. He was discharged in November 1945 with the rank of Staff Sergeant, a Bronze Star for valor during the Rhine crossing, and absolutely no medals or commendations for the chain armor that had saved his life and potentially hundreds of others. The Army didn't give medals for unauthorized modifications, even when they worked. He went back to Kearney, Nebraska. The farm was still there, still barely profitable. His father was older, his brothers had grown up, but the work was the same. Corn and wheat, livestock and machinery that broke down constantly. Morrison picked up like he'd never left. He married a woman named Sarah, in 1947. They had 2 daughters. He took over the farm when his father retired in 1953. The transition back to civilian life was easier for Morrison than for many veterans. He'd grown up on this farm, knew the work, had a place waiting for him. No unemployment, no searching for purpose. Just the familiar rhythm of planting and harvest, the endless cycle of breaking equipment and fixing it with whatever was available. The problem-solving skills he'd developed in combat translated directly back to farming. When the combine broke down in the middle of harvest, Morrison didn't panic or call for expensive repairs. He improvised fixes using fence wire and spare parts, the same way he'd improvised armor using tire chains. The principles were identical. Understand the problem, identify available resources, create a solution that works even if it's not pretty. Sarah understood that her husband had been through something significant in the war, but Morrison didn't talk about it much. He'd come home with a bronze star he kept in a drawer and memories he kept to himself. She learned not to ask too many questions. He'd tell stories if he felt like it, usually after a beer or two with other veterans at the VFW hall, but mostly he stayed quiet about the war. The nightmares came occasionally. Morrison thrashing in bed, calling out names Sarah didn't recognize: Chen, Callahan, Walsh, Parker. Sometimes he'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced he'd heard a Panzerfaust. Launching. Sarah would hold him until the shaking stopped, not asking questions, just being there. The episodes got less frequent over time, but never completely disappeared. He never talked much about the war. When asked, he'd say he drove a half-track and came home. If someone pressed for details, he might mention crossing the Rhine or the drive through Germany. But he didn't talk about the chains. He didn't talk about the Panzerfaust. He didn't talk about the moment when his improvisation saved his life. Once a year, on March 15th, he'd receive a phone call from Danny O'Brien, the Pittsburgh steelworkers kid, who'd been the first to copy Morrison's chain armor. They'd talk for a few minutes, remembering the guys who didn't make it home: Chen, Callahan, Walsh, Parker, and all the others. "Remember when they told us the chains wouldn't work?" O'Brien would say. "Remember when we did it anyway?" Morrison would reply. In 1968, a military historian researching armored vehicle modifications in World War II found references to improvised spaced armor in Third Army reports from 1945. The pattern was specific to half-tracks. The timeline was March through May. The innovation seemed to have originated in the 7th Armored Division. The historian tracked down Morrison through unit records. Morrison agreed to one interview. He explained the method, provided dates and technical details, showed the interviewer photographs he'd kept from the war, including one of his chain-wrapped half-track after the Panzerfaust hit. Then he asked that his name be used only if necessary. He didn't want attention. He didn't want to be portrayed as some kind of genius inventor. He'd just been a farm kid trying not to die, using the same problem-solving skills his father had taught him when fixing broken equipment with whatever was available. The historian wrote the article anyway. It was published in 1971 in the Journal of Armor and Cavalry. The piece credited Staff Sergeant William Morrison of the 7th Armored Division with developing and field testing improvised spaced armor techniques that significantly reduced shaped charge effectiveness against light armored vehicles. The article included Morrison's photographs and a technical analysis of why the chains worked. Morrison received about 20 letters after the article was published. Most were from other veterans who'd used chain armor or similar modifications. A few were from engineers who wanted technical details. One was from a lieutenant colonel at the armor school at Fort Knox, asking if Morrison would be interested in consulting on a study of field improvisation techniques. Morrison declined politely. He had a farm to run, but he appreciated that someone remembered. Modern armored vehicles use the same principle Morrison discovered in 1944. Reactive armor, slat armor, cage armor, all variations on the concept of disrupting shaped charges before they reach primary armor. The M2 Bradley fighting vehicle uses slat armor against RPGs. The Stryker has bolt-on cage armor. Every military in the world teaches spaced armor techniques. The principle hasn't changed. Create standoff distance between the threat and the armor. Disrupt the penetrator before it can form properly. Use simple materials that are available in the field. It's doctrine now, it's in the training manuals, it's taught at every armor school. But it started with a farm kid from Nebraska who couldn't watch his friends die anymore, who looked at truck chains and thought, maybe, who ignored the officers telling him he was wrong and the engineers saying it wouldn't work, who wrapped his half-track in scrap metal and hoped for the best. The chains were ugly. They were unauthorized. They violated field manual specifications. They rattled when the vehicle moved and looked absolutely ridiculous. But on March 15, 1945, when a Panzerfaust hit Bill Morrison's half-track at 20 yards, those ugly, unauthorized, ridiculous chains dispersed a shaped charge jet and saved 5 lives. Sometimes that's exactly what matters. Not whether something looks right or follows regulations or fits what the experts say should work, just whether it works when it needs to. Bill Morrison understood that. He'd learned it growing up on a farm where you fixed things with what you had, not what you wished you had. He applied it in combat when the approved methods were getting his friends killed, and he never asked for credit because the work was its own reward. You know, if you think about it, that's the real story here. Not just the chains or the Panzerfaust or the engineering principle. It's about trusting the people in the field, the ones actually facing the problem, the ones who can't afford to wait for committees to approve solutions because waiting means dying. Morrison didn't have time to wait for engineers to run tests. He had tire chains and a half-track and German anti-tank weapons that were killing his friends. So he solved the problem himself. And when the officers told him he was wrong, he kept the chains anyway, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Because being right according to the manual doesn't matter if you're dead. The Army eventually figured that out. They ran their tests, validated the concept, added it to doctrine. But Morrison was already home by then, back to farming, back to solving problems with wire and improvisation and whatever materials were handy. Same skills, different application. If you're enjoying this story, I want to ask you something. Hit that subscribe button. These histories matter. These men who innovated under fire, who trusted their judgment over regulations, who saved lives through creativity and courage, they deserve to be remembered. And subscribing helps me keep bringing you these stories. Stories that the history books often skip. Stories about corporals and sergeants and farm kids who changed how war was fought, not through grand strategy, but through simple ingenuity. Now, here's what really gets me about this whole thing. The engineering report that finally validated chain armor came out in June 1945. After the war ended, after Morrison had already proven it worked, after hundreds of drivers had already adopted it, after lives had already been saved. The engineers confirmed what the soldiers already knew from experience. The chains worked. That delay, that gap between field innovation and official recognition, it's a pattern you see again and again in military history. The people doing the fighting figure out solutions faster than the institutions can adapt, and sometimes the institutions never catch up. They just document what already happened and take credit for approving it. Morrison didn't care about that. He wasn't waiting for approval, he was trying to survive. And the thing is, he wasn't even unique. Across Europe in 1944 and 45, you had thousands of soldiers modifying their equipment, testing new tactics, solving problems in real time. Most of those innovations never got documented, never made it into reports or journals or official doctrine. They just worked, and then the war ended, and everyone went home. We lost a lot of knowledge that way, a lot of practical wisdom from people who'd learned by doing, by failing, by trying again under fire. Morrison's chain armor is one of the few that got recorded, but how many other solutions existed that we never heard about? How many other farm kids or factory workers or switchmen applied their civilian skills to military problems and saved lives without ever getting recognized? That's what keeps me digging through these archives, looking for those stories. The ones about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, not because they were heroes, but because the situation demanded it and they had the skills and courage to act. William Morrison died in 1992 at age 69, heart failure. He was working on his tractor when it happened, trying to replace a belt that had worn through. His daughters found him in the barn. His obituary in the Kearney Hub mentioned his military service, his 47 years farming, his family. It didn't mention the chains or the Panzerfaust or the lives he saved. Sarah Morrison knew her husband had done something important in the war, but she'd never known exactly what. After he died, she found a box in the attic with his service medals, his discharge papers, and a photograph of a half-track wrapped in chains. She showed it to one of their daughters, who researched it and found the 1971 Journal article. That's how the family learned what Bill had done. Not from him directly, he'd never talked about it, but from a military historian's article written 23 years after the fact. The photograph in the attic matched the photograph in the journal. The date matched. The unit matched. It was definitely Bill's track, Bill's innovation, Bill's life saved by his own refusal to follow regulations that would have killed him. The family donated Bill's photographs and papers to the Nebraska Veterans Museum in 2003. They're in the World War II collection now. If you visit, you can see the image of that chain-wrapped half-track with the scorched impact point where a Panzerfaust hit and failed to penetrate. You can read Morrison's handwritten after-action report. You can see the letter from Lieutenant Hoskins recommending him for recognition that never came. And you can understand something important about how innovation actually happens in war, not through research and development programs or engineering committees, through necessity, through people who refuse to accept that the approved methods are the only methods, through soldiers who trust their own judgment and skill enough to try something everyone says won't work. Bill Morrison was one of those soldiers, a farm kid from Nebraska who understood metal and stress and problem-solving from fixing broken tractors, who applied that understanding to combat, who saved his own life and influenced armored vehicle design for the next 80 years, and who never asked for recognition because the work was what mattered, not the credit. That's American ingenuity right there, folks. Not in some laboratory or factory, but in a muddy street in Germany with a Panzerfaust incoming and 1 second to live or die. Morrison made his choice. He wrapped his track in chains, ignored the officers, and bet his life on his own judgment. The bet paid off. The chains worked. The innovation spread. And even though the Army took months to officially approve what Morrison had proven in 1.2 seconds, even though he never got a medal for it, even though he went home and never talked about it, the principle he discovered is still being used today. Every time you see a Bradley with slat armor, or a Stryker with cage armor, or any modern fighting vehicle with spaced protection, you're seeing Bill Morrison's legacy, the direct descendant of truck tire chains wrapped around a half-track by a sergeant who couldn't watch his friends die anymore. And before we wrap up here, I want to ask you one more time. If this story moved you, if you appreciate learning about these forgotten heroes, hit that like button and subscribe. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. These stories matter. These men matter. And keeping their memories alive, that's how we honor what they did. Bill Morrison didn't fight for fame. He fought for his friends, for his country, for the simple right to come home alive. He succeeded on all counts. And along the way, he changed how we think about armor protection, not through official channels, but through desperate innovation under fire. Sometimes that's how the best ideas happen. Not in committee meetings or testing facilities, but in the field, under pressure, when failure means death and success means getting to see tomorrow. Morrison understood that. He lived it. And even though he never sought recognition, his innovation outlived him by generations. The tire chains are still taught. The principle is still used. But the man who invented it went back to his farm and fixed tractors and never told anyone what he'd done. Sometimes that's exactly right. Sometimes the work is its own reward. Sometimes being alive to plant next year's crop is all the recognition a man needs. That was Bill Morrison, a farm kid from Nebraska who wrapped his half-track in truck chains and stopped a Panzerfaust at 20 yards. The officers called it ugly, unauthorized, and tactically useless. Bill called it insurance. And on March 15, 1945, it saved his life and 4 others when official doctrine would have gotten them all killed. Remember that name. Remember that story. And remember that sometimes the best solutions come from the people everyone's telling to shut up and follow orders. Bill Morrison didn't shut up. He wrapped his track in chains. And 80 years later, armies around the world are still using the principle he proved that day in Worms. That's the kind of American fighting spirit that won that war. Not just following orders, but thinking, adapting, innovating under fire. That's what made the difference. That's what we need to remember. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. These stories deserve to be told. These men deserve to be honored. And if you enjoyed this, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We've got more stories like this, more forgotten heroes, more innovations born of necessity and courage. Until next time, keep these memories alive. Keep asking questions. Keep remembering that the best answers often come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes from a sergeant wrapping his half-track in tire chains because he trusted his own judgment more than he trusted the manual. Bill Morrison was right. The manual was wrong, and 5 men lived because of it. That's all for today, folks. Thanks for listening.